Thank you very much, Principal, and a very warm welcome. Can I reiterate the welcome? It's fantastic to see so many people here today. It's also a delight to be able to introduce and welcome Tom Wright, Professor Tom Wright. I'm sure known to many of you through his writing, speaking, broadcasting around the world. As you know, he's a former Bishop of Durham. He's also served as a professor at the University of St Andrews. He's written over 80 books in the last few years. We'll be talking about some of them, not all of them by any means. But perhaps we could start off with just tell us, when were you last here in this room?
The last time I remember being in this room, I've been to New College many times, but when I walked in here, I suddenly had a flashback that in the summer of 1970, during the Edinburgh Festival, my then fiancée, subsequently wife for the last 51 years, and I came to a performance of As You Like It here in the assembly room, assembly hall, it's called. Yes. And so suddenly I remembered that. Edinburgh has been a special place to me from boyhood because I grew up in Northumberland, and Edinburgh and Newcastle were the two cities that I knew best. So it's always a delight to be back here.
Now, you spent a lot of your life studying a small collection of books, about 27 of them, called the New Testament. Yes. Why study the New Testament?
Well, the New Testament's been part of my life without me really choosing it. It just happened that way, growing up in a church-going family, a very ordinary, middle-of-the-road Anglican family, but the Bible was always there or thereabouts. And in my teens, through actually being in Scotland for summer camps organised by the Scripture Union, I basically fell in love with the New Testament, and especially the letters of Paul, just because they were so fascinating, raising all kinds of issues. And friends and I would hang out, and we'd be lying in a tent on a rainy day and trying to figure out what Colossians was really all about. So it became a hobby. And it never occurred to me I would study it in the sort of academic sense, because it was just fun and interesting. And then when I was a student, when I was an undergraduate, I was studying classics and philosophy, and the questions that the New Testament were bouncing off the walls of my classical studies and my philosophical studies. So it's just kind of grown. So in a sense, I've never had to face the question, why study it? It's just, okay, granted that this is a really important text, now what? If somebody was coming in from the outside, I would say, well, even if you have no particular personal interest in Christianity, actually what happened in the first 1/3 of the first century AD, and then in the fallout from that in the next sort of 40 years or so, changed the world. And it manifestly has changed the world, as the historian Tom Holland has argued recently. In order to understand our world, it really helps to understand what Christianity was and is, which is why I always regret it when in school syllabuses they may study the Greeks and the Romans, but if you say, where does Jesus or the New Testament come in there, it comes in a period called religion at sort of 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, rather than in the rest of the curriculum. And I think it's time to reverse that and say, this stuff actually matters for understanding how the world is and why all sorts of other things have happened. Obviously, I could develop that.
Let's go to one of your bestsellers, a recent bestseller on God and the pandemic. Why did you write that, and what's the argument?
The reason I wrote it was an accident. When the pandemic began, which was, 2.5 years ago, and I should say I'm recovering from long COVID myself at the moment. It may not sound like that, but it feels like that. There was a flurry of speculation, particularly in America, but washing over into Britain, among different Christian circles. Some people saying, this is God punishing us for being wicked on this or that or the other, and other people saying, this is a sign of the end of the world, and other people saying, oh, it's a wonderful evangelistic opportunity because people are talking about death and so on. And I was phoned up by an editor on Time magazine who I got to know some years ago, and she said, could you just write us 700 words on what you think the significance of the pandemic is? So I find, okay, always a sucker for that kind of thing. So I did. And I basically said, forget those silly theories. The first thing to say is this is a call to lament. It's a call to lament, and it's only out of lament that hope might grow. And I got stick for that, apparently. I don't do Twitter, but friends told me that there was a bit of a storm telling me off. Surely N.T. Wright knows that the prophet Amos says that if something like this happens, it's because God is cross with you. So I then started to do the odd lecture on it and some Zoom lectures and so on. And after a week or two of doing that, I said to the publishers, why don't I just write this out? And they said, oh, go on then. And so it was. That appeared, I finished writing it just before Easter what year was it? 2020, I suppose, yeah. And the basic argument is that those trivial under-interpretations, the sort of sub-Christian interpretations, really don't get to the heart of what the Bible says about serious problems, whether it's wars and rumors of wars or earthquakes or violence or disease. And that when we look at the book of Job and when we look at the Psalms, and then when we look at the Gospels, we don't see Jesus saying, aha, you're sick, that's because you've been a very naughty little boy, and this a quote, by the way, and you have to repent and do this. Jesus takes a totally different line, and this joins up with the larger issue, which is something the theologians discuss, that how do we give an account of God's action in the world? And many theologians have tried in the last couple of hundred years to talk about God's action in the world, leaving Jesus out of the question, as though it's a sort of an interventionist deist model. I know that's a contradiction in terms, but it's sort of God outside and occasionally reaching in and doing odd things, and what account can we give of that? In the New Testament, God acts in the world in and through and as Jesus. And I focus in the book on the fact that Jesus is the Jesus who wept at the tomb of his friend. He knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, but he wept because he shared the pain of the world. And it seems to me that the call to lament is the call that we all should have, faced with whatever tragedies there are going on. Not that we can instantly understand them, but to lament is to say something about the fact that the world is not as we wish it were, and that we hope and pray that God doesn't wish it to be like this either. And it's out of that lament, a kind of an honesty, that hope can grow. So that's really how the thing developed.
What do you mean by broken signposts?
Okay. This was another accidental book. I didn't expect to write this one. As I was working on the Gifford Lectures, which I did a few years ago in Aberdeen, there was one particular point in there where I was developing some ideas I'd had in an earlier book about signals of something going on in the world. And I listed the fact that all human beings everywhere know that these things matter: justice, spirituality, relationships, beauty. And in this book, I've added 3 more: freedom, truth, and power. And the thing is, everybody knows these things matter. Some people would say they are signs that there is a God who cares about justice and beauty and so on. And in a sense, I would agree with that. But the problem about justice and relationships and beauty and freedom and so on is that we constantly mess them up. We know that justice matters, but it's darned hard to do. We know that relationships are what makes the world go round, and we constantly mess them up, etc., etc., etc. And as I was pondering that and thinking, can these therefore in some way be a signpost to God, I suddenly realized, and I know exactly where I was actually on the golf course in Crail near St Andrews when this suddenly occurred to me, that of course the Jesus of the Gospels is a Jesus who suffered massive injustice, whose relationships were fractured, whose the beauty of whose public career was completely destroyed on the cross. And you can work right through all those 7. In other words, the brokenness of the signposts points to this strange narrative of the crucifixion of Jesus, and says, actually, it's not that these are pointing upwards to God, it's that God has come down to share the brokenness of our world. And so as a riff through those, I use the Gospel of John in that book as a way of exploring each of those, because John has a lot to say about justice and freedom and truth and power and stuff like that. So in short compass, that's what the
Perhaps
book's
we could
about.
focus on one broken place at the moment and think about Ukraine. I'd like to imagine you're perhaps on a golf course with Patriarch Kirill, and you've got a few minutes to speak with him. What would you say to him?
Yeah.
That's the leader of the...
Yeah, Patriarch Kirill, yes. I met his predecessor once, who was quite an austere character. I did once meet Vladimir Putin himself when I was a canon of Westminster. I had to show him the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior and so on. That was 20 years ago. I remember something Rowan Williams said at the beginning of the Lambeth Conference in 2008. He said that what one bishop ought to say to another bishop, you ought to begin by saying, I am a great sinner, but Christ is a great saviour. I remember at the time thinking, where does that get us? And part of the point is that I would want, of course, to say to Patriarch Kirill, and shake him by the lapels and say, how can you be standing by and encouraging Putin to do what he's doing, and don't you realize how wicked it is, etc., which simply would go straight over his head, because he is living out of a narrative in which, quite truthfully, I would say, the West has become degenerate, has become a land of squodgy, moral non-absolutes, and in particular, the West has broken many promises made to Russia in times gone by about where NATO was going to extend to, etc. Now, without going into all the geopolitics of that, I would just say, yeah, it's messy. It isn't that we in the West are completely right and they over there are completely wrong. We too have done terrible, horrible things in various places around the world. Now, putting that on the table, I am a great sinner, what would it mean to say Christ is the great saviour? In other words, as you, Patriarch Kirill, read the Gospels, which I assume you do, certainly in the liturgy and possibly privately as well, what emerges from the Sermon on the Mount to you which might make you think again about what's currently going on? That's as best as I could do.
That's fascinating how you draw us back to Christian origins, to the New Testament.
Yeah.
So perhaps we could move towards your series of books on Christian origins. And you've written thousands of words on Christian origins, and this series of 4 or 5 books, bestsellers around the world. Again, what were you trying to do?
That series, like so much in my life, has been a happy accident. From quite early on, when I did my doctorate on Paul, and as I was doing my doctorate on Paul, I was also doing some teaching of undergraduates, and I became more and more interested in questions to do with who Jesus really was in his historical context. And I realized, because I was looking at the context of the first century Jewish world to understand Paul, and the more I did that, the more I realized it shed a lot of light on what I had taken for granted about the Jewish world in which Jesus lived and how he interacted with that. And so I had a sabbatical in 1989. I went to Jerusalem. I was teaching at the Hebrew University, and I was trying to write these 2 books side by side, one on Jesus and one on Paul. As I did that, I realized that in order to get to actually handling the issues properly, I needed to do a much fuller statement about how we know anything about history at all, so a whole methodological chunk, and then particularly, how do we know about first century Jews and their world, or their worlds, because Judaism was diverse then as it is now, perhaps not quite so much as it is now, but quite a bit. And then I realized with a shock that I was actually planning 3 books, an introduction, then Jesus, then Paul. So it's really, and then when I was nearly finished, I thought, the Jesus book, the publisher came to me and said, look, we have already printed the covers for this book. This gives you a maximum of 650 pages. What are you going to miss out? Oh. So I thought, okay, I'll just miss out the last chapter, which is on the resurrection, and I will do a nice little book, which will put that in. So fine, okay, except the nice little book turned into the then largest of, it's 750 pages.
Another accident. I like these accidents.
Because, and it's about history, because as I started to read what people had said about the resurrection, I realized that there were massive misunderstandings. I mean, just plain as the nose on your face misunderstandings about what the ancient texts, whether it's the New Testament or books like Second Maccabees or treatments of life after death in Greek philosophers or whatever, people were giving approximations of these which really didn't get to the heart of what was going on. And out of that, the confusion which I knew from my own discussions with students and so on, and my own life as a member of the Church of England, where people use the word resurrection in a vague, fluffy way to mean life after death, which of course it doesn't. Resurrection is life after death. We could talk some more about that if you like. It's bodily resurrection, so that at every point I had to clean up what was going on in order then to lay out the argument. So that was the resurrection book. And the Paul book just grew, because I'd written one or two other books on Paul, and the reviewers had said, but you didn't deal with this, or, oh, you never really gave us a treatment of that. So, okay, you want the full thing. Here it is. So the Paul book is 2 volumes, and congratulations to anyone who's been able to work right through it.
You've also got a biography as well on Paul.
Yeah, the biography was great fun. They said, okay, you've done all this work on Paul, now tell us the story. What was he like? It was interesting because the editor I was working with, I kept on putting little quotes from Acts in to say, this is what happened next. I don't want to know how Luke tells the story, I want to know how you told the story. So I pushed all that aside, and I thoroughly enjoyed, for instance, retelling the story of Paul's shipwreck, as though I was an observer of it myself. And retelling the story of Paul and Barnabas going to Jerusalem, and I imagined Barnabas saying to Paul, look, just stick with the story of what we've done. Don't get into the theology and exegesis. It'll go straight over their heads and you will lose the argument. Let Peter and James do the heavy lifting. I mean, Paul was a wonderful guy, but he must have been an incredibly high-maintenance friend. So what's he going to say next? And the closer I got to Paul, the more it kind of made sense. And for me, one of the things which I am most pleased about with that book is that I sent the manuscript to the late, great Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who I knew just a little bit from here and there. And I said, Jonathan, I want you as an Orthodox Jew to tell me if there is anything in this book which strikes a false note with you. And he phoned me up a week or two later, and there was one passage which he said, we would never put it like that. So fine, that goes, we'll say it quite differently. And he was kind enough to write a nice blurb for the book. But I thought, Paul was a Jew, a very conflicted Jew. How does that work? What does that look like? I've got a friend who is Jewish by background, but actually an Anglican priest now, who said that when he read that book, he finally got it. He said, this is the Jewish Paul who helps me understand what it means to be a Jew and a follower of Jesus Christ.
What would you say to the critic who says your passion for Paul has corrupted your understanding of the resurrection?
Wow. That's not a line anyone has ever said to me before.
Not corrupted, but dominated. Perhaps the better word is dominated. It's dominated how you look at it.
Dominated how we look at the resurrection.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, obviously, Paul is one of the great theologians of resurrection. You've got 1 Corinthians 15, but also Romans 8 and many other passages, where obviously for Paul, the resurrection of Jesus is absolutely foundational. Without that, there is no, as far as Paul would be concerned, there is no Christianity. Jesus would just have been one more failed Messiah. They had plenty in the first century. There are roughly a dozen messianic or quasi-messianic movements either side of Jesus in the first century. Josephus tells us about them and so on. Routinely, they end with the death of the founder. And after that, you've got a choice. If you're still alive yourself, if you've been following this would-be Messiah, you've either got to give up the movement or you've got to get another Messiah, perhaps a relative. Very interesting. The great leader of the church in Jerusalem in the first century after Jesus' death was James, the brother of... Nobody ever said that James was the Messiah. Josephus describes him as the brother of the so-called Messiah. They knew that it was Jesus because the resurrection meant, as in Romans 1, 3 and 4, this is... So, Paul and resurrection are absolutely like that. But, again, the Gospels only make the sense they make if that was the end of the story. I mean, that's a whole other question as to why the Gospels are what they are. And likewise, my colleague in St Andrews, David Moffat, argued very cogently that despite the popular impression, the letter to the Hebrews is actually demands a solid resurrection doctrine in the middle of it. And of course, the book of Revelation, I died and behold I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and hell. This is absolutely front and center. So you can't deal with the resurrection without dealing with Paul, but I don't think that corrupts it. I think that kind of tees it up for everything that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. There's so many ways we could go with the conversation. There'll be a chance for you to ask questions in a few minutes as well. But perhaps we could go to another book you recently wrote, which is this commentary on Galatians. Why do we need another commentary on Galatians?
Oh dear. When you alerted me to that question, my mind went back 20 years ago when I was writing the commentary on Romans for the New Interpreter's Bible, and I was on sabbatical in Oxford, and I met an old friend, John Drury, who was then Dean of Christ Church. And, "Oh, Tom, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I'm on sabbatical." "Oh, what are you working on?" I said, "Writing a commentary on Romans." "Oh," he said, "I suppose it's really important that every so often we have another commentary on Romans." And I thought, "Oh, gee, thanks." To that I want to say, having mentioned Shakespeare in here, why is it important that we have another performance of As You Like It? Why is it important that we have another performance of Beethoven's Emperor Concerto? These things are texts which, okay, if you're a really shrewd theatre goer, you can probably sit down with Shakespeare and imagine the play. Much better to have it actually staged. And the Bible is a text to be staged, and part of that staging is the unfolding of what's... Galatians is an amazingly dense book. Line after line, it's packed in there. Paul is writing at white heat. He's skipping over bits of the argument, and he's assuming things. And most people, including most scholars, I think, find it really difficult to unpack and see what's really going on. And so the commentary is a way of performing the text, and this commentary happens to be in a series called, you can probably just see it, Commentaries for Christian Formation. And I was glad of that because Galatians is about Christian formation. And for me particularly, Galatians have been part of my life as long as Romans has. And they kind of jangle against one another a bit. But it's only in the last 10 years or so, as I've been working on Galatians in its very Jewish context again, and there's lots of things that we now know about the first century Jewish world, which some of my own PhD students have helped me think through and have fed into this book. But it's emerged that Galatians is not, despite what many people think, a book about how you don't have to do moral good works in order to go to heaven. That's not the question. That is simply not on the agenda. Galatians is about the fact that all those who believe in Jesus the Messiah belong at the same table together. Neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, all one in Messiah Jesus. And that was a huge issue in the first century. It remains a huge issue today. And here's the irony, which I hope my book will address. The Reformation, which highlighted Galatians as the great book about how you're justified by grace through faith, completely ignored the corollary of that if that is so, you must not divide the church into master and slave, into black and white, into Jew and Gentile. And so, because we had the passion in the 16th century to have the Bible and the liturgy in our own language, which of course I totally affirm, people didn't even notice that then generated, say in London in the late 16th century, you'd have a Polish church and a Portuguese church and a French church and a Spanish church, and nobody thought it mattered. And maybe it didn't matter terribly at the time, but my goodness, look where we are now. And the unity of the church, which was fragmented linguistically and then culturally and then ethnically, enabled us to collude with real wickedness in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, as you don't need me to spell out. I would like to see Galatians back where it belongs, as addressing those issues and not the tired polemics of a post-Reformation soteriology.
You've been terrifyingly productive. Just terrifying. I look at the books and I think, how do you do that? But that wasn't always the case, was it? And I'm just interested, was there like a breakthrough moment that suddenly you started writing and have been unable to stop ever since? And what's behind that? If you had any advice for mere mortals who write 4 words a year, what would you...
It's a curious thing. I mean, I think I'm old enough to be self-aware enough to say that words, for some reason, have always come easily to me. My late mother, who died just before her 96th birthday, said to me latterly, looking at a shelf full of my books, she said, "Well, I always did say you had too much to say for yourself. Maybe there was some point to it." So, gee, thanks, Mum. And that's just how it's been. For me, I happened to come of age as a scholar when computers first arrived in the early 80s. And I suddenly realized this is going to make an enormous difference. And being able to think straight onto the screen and edit as you go along meant that all sorts of possibilities were there, which in the days of longhand and having a secretary to type things out simply didn't exist. So I was lucky like that. A couple of other things. I had a sense quite early on, in the early 1980s after I'd done my doctorate, that I come from the northeast, which is a mining area, so a mining example, that I was like a miner with a pickaxe suddenly discovering a seam of coal that seemed to be really good coal. And when I was teaching, my students would say, hey, this is really interesting, we haven't quite heard this before, and I would think, yeah, I want to get this out. I had a big setback in that one of the senior scholars in the field read my thesis and said, this is wonderful, it should be published, sent it to a publisher, who then sent it to another reader, and I think I know who it was, but I'm not going to mention a name, but who rubbished it. And that was in the early 80s, and I thought, well, I'm not going to do that again. I'm not going to send something off until I'm absolutely ready to do it. So the 80s, I did do some writing, but then, and it was when I turned 40, you know, as in the Schwäbische, the South German life begins at 40 thing. And I remember how it happened, that I read a book by a scholar roughly my own age, which I didn't think was a terribly good book, and I could see flaws in it. And then I looked and saw all these great scholars had written nice blurbs about it. What a wonderful book. And I thought, for goodness sake, we can do better than that. And then in 1988, I turned 40, and I remember thinking, you know, damn it, I'm 40, I'm just going to write what I like now. And I lightened up. Of course, until then, especially coming from an Oxford and Cambridge background, I'd had this vision of grizzled old theologians like Dennis Nineham or Maurice Wiles looking over my shoulder and saying, oh, we stopped saying that sort of thing in 1953, or you can't possibly want to work on that sort of thing. And there was that sort of putting down thing. And I just told those guys, metaphorically, to get lost. I'm just going to write what I want to say. And in a sense, I've been doing that ever since. Not that there haven't been some interesting rebuffs along the way.
So you've been a dean, a bishop, a canon theologian, a professor, an honorary research associate, and the list goes on. How would you say, if you think about those different contexts, those different roles and vocations, how does that change your role as a writer, a researcher?
It's really interesting as I look back. When I was first teaching, it was in the university context, first in McGill and then back in Oxford. And you're very focused, and you've got courses to teach, and the students have to be prepared for exams, and I didn't get a huge amount of writing done then, actually, but except on sabbatical. But then I went to be Dean of Lichfield, and I found myself hosting an international arts festival for 12 days every summer. And it happened in the cathedral, but the internationally famous musicians and artists would come and stay in the deanery and so on. And I found myself then wanting to interpret what was going on in the cathedral with the music and the art in terms of, in theological terms and biblical terms. And this happened at the same time as I was starting to work on the whole question of resurrection and new creation. And I realized that what was happening was that art and music were becoming, for me at least, signs of new creation, in the sense that they are pointers forward to a new reality. Obviously, art can degenerate into nostalgia, but that it can actually also point forward. And I think, had I just stayed in Oxford, I mightn't have really realized that. And of course, that then had an extraordinary corollary, in that in 2000, when Lichfield Cathedral was celebrating its 1300th anniversary, Paul Spicer, who was the director of the festival, was a composer, asked if I would collaborate with him. We wrote an Easter oratorio together. I wrote the words based on John's Gospel with lots of other stuff. He wrote the music. And that sort of did what I'd been thinking about. And then the resurrection work then for the big book grew out of that. Then when I was in Westminster, right across the street from the Houses of Parliament, it just so happened that the work I've been doing on Paul had taken a political turn in terms of Paul saying Jesus is Lord, meaning that Caesar isn't Lord. And that's a much more interesting thing to say if you're living right opposite the House of Lords. You know, trying to figure out how the Pauline gospel lands in contemporary political discourse. So that was a wonderful time for that. Then when I went to Durham, back to my own native northeast, of course that part of the country is very poor, very poverty-stricken. All the traditional industries, shipbuilding, coal, etc., steel, they're all decimated or gone entirely. And ministering to parishes that had suffered that and still didn't know who on earth they were was really, really important. And I wrote 2 or 3 little books which emerged out of that, but I felt that sense of being alongside people who were absolutely down at the bottom of the heap and who thought that the world had forgotten them, because it often had, coloured everything else I was doing. Not to send me scurrying back to a early 20th century social gospel, but to draw out, for goodness sake, what's there in the gospels themselves, which is what the liberation theologians would call God's preferential option for the poor. But the fact is that in the DNA of the church from the beginning, the care for the poor, the care for the sick, and the need for education were always part of what the church was doing. So for me, there was a kind of an extraordinary confluence. And particularly as a bishop, you have a public platform and you preach a sermon and suddenly it's in the newspapers, or somebody is commenting angrily about it in the newspapers. And it seems to me, if you're given that platform for however short a time, you've got to try and use it. So because I was one of the very few people from the Northeast in the House of Lords, I tried to see where the concerns were coming from the Northeast. And I mean, things like, thinking of the poor, 2008, the financial crash, which you will all remember, no doubt, there was a huge debate in the House of Lords about what's going to happen now, how are we going to make things work. And there were about, I don't know, 50 speakers, almost all about, oh dear, how can we help the banks to get back on their feet? I was the only person who pointed out that what had happened was that the very rich had just done for the very rich what we'd refused to do for the very poor, namely remit debts, etc. And it seems to me somebody has to stand up and say that kind of thing from time to time. And that was flowing out of my New Testament work into public life and back into the New Testament work again. And, you know, that just seemed kind of, okay, we're here, I happen to be holding this microphone, let's see what we can do with it.
We've had some questions sent in by some young New Testament scholars, and I'm really grateful for them. That question that I just asked actually was from a colleague, so thank you very much for that. There's a couple more I'd like to ask, and then I'll open to the 2 or 3 more I'd like to ask, and then open to the floor. One of them was based around Stephen Neal's famous book, which tells the history of New Testament interpretation from 1866 to 1966. And you added another chapter, didn't you, on the 20 years, the interpretation from 66 to 86. And the question was this: if you were to write another chapter about describing New Testament interpretation from 86 to now, like the last 40 years, briefly, what would you put in that chapter? So I'm just asking you to summarize New Testament scholarship over the last 40 years in 30 seconds.
Yeah. Well, the publishers actually have twice asked me if I would write such a chapter. Yeah. I've declined, partly because I've been kind of at ground level trying to do the work myself, and it would be a bit artificial to exclude my own work from it, but that would be an odd task. But, I mean, in the 80s already, but then particularly in the 90s, there was a sudden turn, which I've alluded to already, into the political in New Testament studies. In the 70s and 80s, people were reading stuff about Jesus being Lord and not making the Caesar connection at all, except very occasionally. And suddenly, people like Richard Horsley in the States were doing that, partly because of Ronald Reagan. There were New Testament scholars in America who were so fed up with Ronald Reagan that surely the New Testament has to say something to these wretched people. And so I've done a lot of work with that, and that would be one of them. Obviously, the other big things, the whole arrival of reader response theory was massive then. I think it's maybe rather passé now. But then particularly the feminist movement, and think of scholars like Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza and others. But then, since then, it's gone in all directions, and it will be a very tricky task to try to map all the different things. This is, you know, welcome to postmodernity. It is what it's all about. So we've post-colonial interpretation, post this, post that, post the other. We've had interestingly, European philosophers like Agamben and Zizek and Badiou pitching in from sometimes a secular philosophical point. Maybe there's something we can learn from the New Testament, and then maybe we New Testament scholars can learn from what they're seeing. This would be a wonderful, exciting project, but it's now got enormous. The other thing is, and I was told off for this when I did the original project, there's nothing about third world scholarship. But there's a lot of creative scholarship going on in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. Trouble is, I hear about it from time to time. I glance at the odd thing. Life is short. There's a lot of stuff. I don't read all those relevant languages. But there is stuff happening. And I think Stephen Neal was working out of the old paradigm, which was basically Britain plus Germany plus friends. The other big thing that's happened is that the center of gravity in biblical studies has shifted from Germany to America. And that means it's shifted from a substantially Lutheran framework to a substantially religious studies American academic framework. And that's made an enormous difference. In some ways, it's opened all sorts of things up. In other ways, it's introduced new prejudices in place of the old ones. But that would be a very long story to tell.
In the 1980s, 1990s, Pauline scholarship was turned on its head. What's happened to that, sometimes known as the sort of new perspective? What's happened to that now?
Yeah, I mean, the new perspective was basically a way of saying, we've all got this thing wrong. Paul is not critical of Judaism because they were proto-Pelagians trying to earn their salvation by doing moral good works. That's a comparatively modern myth. Actually, Karl Barth saw this already in the Church Dogmatics in the 1950s. He saw it very clearly. But that has been in the bloodstream of New Testament scholarship for long enough. And in the 70s and 80s, a bunch of us were saying from quite different angles, that simply won't do. It's not a fair account of Judaism, and it muddles up Paul as well. That's the new perspective, that what then was Paul's critique of the Jewish world of his day, if he had one. Since then, there has been pushback. There are bits of German scholarship particularly which have not wanted to know about this new perspective. There are bits of American scholarship, particularly among the kind of uber-reformed in America, who really regard the new perspective as the last word in heresy. So that's all still going on. But then there have been different movements out beyond. And the question comes back, as with my biography of Paul, okay, as we learn more and more about the Jewish world of the first century, and that's been the great thing that's happened in the last 70 years or so. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are just one example of it. We know far much more about what it was like being a first century Jew. How do we read the New Testament in that context to do justice historically, which is where it counts? And so there have then been pushbacks, particularly I think of people like Paula Fredrickson and Mark Nanos, movement known now as Paul within Judaism, trying to make out that Paul stayed as a good Jew within that box and that Christianity was a good thing for Gentiles, but the Jews could just stay as Jews. That's an oversimple summary, by the way, and Matthew Novenson will tell you more about it if you ask him nicely. So that's a kind of an uneasy moment, I think, where it's not quite clear where things are going. I hope that my Galatians commentary may shed some light on some of that. I don't know.
Where do you see the future of New Testament studies going?
I would love to think that people in this generation will once again say these texts deserve to be studied historically in their context, line by line, letter by letter, theme by theme, rather than saying, oh, we've done all that, now let's play around with them and do some sort of fancy footwork, postmodern interpretation. Plenty of room for postmodern interpretation, but we urgently need for the next generation people who will sit down with the text, learn it by heart, get it into their bloodstream, and agonize over the fact that this bit doesn't seem quite to mesh with this bit, what's going on, how does it work, etc. Out of that, scholarship grows. And those sparks, and you know, the New Testament is full of such places which we're only just really starting to get to grips with. It's funny, Oscar Kuhlman, the great scholar from 2 generations ago, as a young man was told that there was nothing needing doing in New Testament, it had all been done now, so why not go and do patristics instead? So he did, and then he discovered that actually there were some things still needing doing in the New Testament, because each generation thinks it's sort of solved the problems, but in fact we haven't. There's much, much more to do. And it starts with people who want to say, I want to immerse myself in this text, in that world, and try to understand the text in its own terms, and then see what the result will be. And that's the lovely open-endedness of it. For me, being committed to the authority of Scripture, which is an interesting, complicated phrase in itself, by the way, doesn't mean closing off questions. It means a starting point for opening questions. And that needs to be done in every generation.
Some people say one of your major contributions is the way you've turned views about going to heaven on its head.
Okay, this is a whole other project. I've got to go to America in a couple of weeks' time and do some lectures about this, so it's been fresh in my mind. How can I possibly say this to these good people? Shock them. The whole Western tradition, way back behind the Reformation, Aquinas, Augustine, has thought that the story the Bible tells is about how human beings need to find their way up to God in heaven, when in fact, the story the Bible tells is about God making a world, peopling it with his image bearers, because he wants to come and live with them. Genesis is about that. Revelation, the strapline in Revelation 21 is the dwelling of God is with humans, not the dwelling of humans is with God. Because the New Jerusalem is... Yeah, can I just tell this story? A few years ago, I had the privilege of going to Covent Garden to a staged performance of Verdi's Requiem. It was spectacular. And in that wonderful Liberame Domine de Morte Eterna with the soprano solo, the chorus was singing this, lighting candles, and each person lit a candle and then had to make their way up a staircase on either side of the stage until they were all singing up at the top. The soprano solo was left trying to light her candle, and eventually she couldn't light it, and the lights, which was what the director had intended, and it was heart-stopping. And I sat there thinking, that is brilliant theatre and lousy theology. Because the story is not about how we go up to heaven, it's about God. You know, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and that's not a sort of a temporary faute de mieux to achieve another end. That was what it was all about. And in a sense, this is what my work has been saying all along, but it's only in the last 5 years or so that I've really articulated it as sharply as I'm doing to you now. And the trouble is, all our hymns and many of our prayers go entirely the opposite direction. Even beloved Charles Wesley, till we cast our crowns before thee, lost in wonder, love and praise. That's a reference to Revelation 4. But Revelation 4 isn't about the ultimate state. That's what's going on in the heavenly dimension right now. The ultimate state is the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven to earth. And when Jesus taught us to pray, thy kingdom come on earth as in heaven, maybe he just meant it.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got a couple of microphones. We'd be really interested to hear if you've got questions, thoughts, comments, ideas for another book or two to write. I have a hand gone up straight away there, and the microphone is coming at some speed across the hall here, so thank you. Do introduce yourself when you get the microphone, and if you can wait until the mic gets to you, that's great. Thank you. So just there, thank you. And if there was a second question, we can pass another mic to them to save time. Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's on, I think. Just speak into it. It's on. I don't think you need to touch it.
My name is Noam Hatzel. I'm a PhD in world Christianity. I'm not too familiar with the world of biblical studies, but I can gather that you are very prolific within that academic field, but you're also very prolific within writing books for general audiences. And my question was, what do you think as an academic, what do we gain and what do we lose from writing books that are catered towards a more general audience? And I think, there's room for both, academics who stick within academia and academics who, talk to the popular audience.
Thank you. It's horses for courses. We academic New Testament scholars utterly depend on people who make concordances and dictionaries and things like that. Those are very serious tools. We absolutely need them. Some people have the vocation to do that, and I'm suspecting that the people who make dictionaries and concordances and so on are probably not writing books for 10-year-olds at the same time. They might, but it's perhaps less likely. I happen to have stumbled into that world because I did a lot of preaching. I still do a certain amount, but I was doing a lot of preaching in the 80s and 90s. And once or twice, people said, you should collect those sermons and turn them into a little book. And so I did. And I found that people liked it. And, oh, my goodness, guess what? So it's kind of a sideline. And then the publishers asked me to do a series of commentaries, popular commentaries on the whole New Testament, which is like being asked to row single-handed across the Atlantic. You know, you sort of get past Matthew and Mark, and it's like we just passed Ireland, and we've still got a lot of the Atlantic to go. But actually, it was great fun. C.S. Lewis said something, I forget where, one of his essays, where he says that actually theologians, I think he meant all clergy, ought to have to pass an exam translating a work of theology into the vernacular. He said, if you can't do that, you either don't understand it or you don't believe it. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, okay. So instead of splashing long words around and hoping that they'll mean something to someone somewhere, let's actually cash them out and see what we're actually talking about. In that, I was greatly helped by the fact of having a very articulate but non-theologically minded wife and 4 very articulate and pushy children who would say, come on, Dad, you know we don't understand those silly long words. What are you really talking about? Okay, so that's how it's been for me. But I think, again, horses for courses. And I know some people who really do have a ministry of writing popular books who maybe have written the odd academic book, but that's just not where they are right now. And I'm a great believer in the body of Christ, in the diversification of vocations. I happen to have been trying to do those 2 things side by side, and it's been fun. And there's been a lot of crossover. I've learnt about the one from the other.
Another question. Tim, over here. There's a gentleman here. Thank you. Tim Jones.
I'm Tim Jones. I'm a councillor here for the City of Edinburgh, so you might not be surprised if my question is political. I read recently in one of your commentaries that you described the Pharisees as in modern terms, as a political pressure group. I was intrigued by that because I had never seen it like that before, and I would really like you to expand on what you mean by that or how you arrived at that conclusion.
Right. I think I grew up with a view of the Pharisees that they were in charge, that they were running Judaism. And of course they weren't. The chief priests, who included mostly Sadducees, they were actually in charge, and they were combining with the Roman governor to run things. The Pharisees would like to have been running things, but they were a party that had grown up, which was, it had different fringes and softer versions and harder versions, but basically it was trying to say, if we can teach the Jewish people to keep God's law properly, then God will finally fulfill his promises, liberate us from the oppression that we're in, and bring about his long-awaited reign of justice and peace, etc. Some of them were wanting to do that through teaching and so on. Some were wanting to do it ultimately through violence. And I see the people who get to be called eventually zealots as really the sort of the violent wing of the Pharisees. And I think that's going on in the debates between the Hillelites and the Shammaites. That's probably too much information at the moment. But in the time of Jesus, they are a pressure group who are determined to watch out for what people are up to. And so, rather like journalists in the present world, who many journalists come quite properly with a strong political agenda and are always on the lookout for people who are doing the wrong thing or possibly doing the right thing, who they can then talk up. And it seems to me that the Pharisees are eager for the new thing that God is supposed to be doing, and if somebody seems to be behaving in a way that is going against that, that may slow that down or hinder it, then they will pounce and they will say, what do you mean doing this? But they do not, qua Pharisee, hold any official position. There are some Pharisees in the Sanhedrin, as we see in Acts when Paul puts the cat among the pigeons by talking to the Sanhedrin and mentioning resurrection, which the Pharisees believed in and the Sadducees didn't. But see, that's a case in point. Believing in resurrection is because resurrection is a revolutionary doctrine. It means God's going to remake the whole show. This is so we've got to do whatever it takes at the moment to get things ready for that. The Sadducees, who are the conservatives, don't want that at all. Which is funny because in our world it tends to be the conservatives who believe in the resurrection and the radicals who don't. But that just shows how confusing our language is.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Thank you.
Do introduce
my name is
yourself.
Atom Utuk.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so from my context and from my perspective, I would like to ask you, Prof, being distinguished in New Testament scholarship and having widely researched, I would like to ask, sorry for my own point of view, would you say that Pauline letters, or more so the New Testament, would you say have done justice to the social and religious position of women? And secondly, why would women, like I said from my context, be put in a situation where they have to fight or struggle to find their feet? And then finally, what would be your assessment of the feminist movement from the first wave till now on completing or completely breaking the glass ceiling?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the different waves of feminism. I hear about these things and I know very little about them, but I can't comment in detail on that. It seems to me that in many areas of which the position of women is one, there are things going on in the New Testament which are potentially explosive, but which didn't all explode at the same time. I mean, the obvious case is slavery, that in the ancient world, pretty well everyone had one or more slaves, and that was just how the world was run. That's like electricity or the internal combustion engine in our world today. We may know that these things are polluting the atmosphere, but we can't currently do without them. And yet, we see depth charges being put against these institutions. Now, for the place of women, and I would go to the passage I already quoted from Galatians 3, neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, no male and female. It's hugely significant for Paul that whereas in the Jewish world, circumcision, which was male circumcision, was the badge of covenant membership, among the followers of Jesus, baptism is the outward badge, which is identical for men and women. And for Paul, that's ground level, that it isn't that the man in the family has the covenant sign, it's the man and the woman. But then we see that working out. One of my favorite little bits on this is Romans 16, where when Paul writes what I would say is one of the greatest letters, if not the greatest letter from the world of antiquity, namely Romans, who does he give it to take? He gives it to somebody called Phoebe, who is a deacon in the church in Cenchreae, which is the eastern port of Corinth. And from what we know about ancient letter customs, it's highly likely that if Phoebe took the letter to Rome, she would be the one who would read it out in the different house churches. And it's somewhere between possible and probable that having done that, she might well be the one who would be asked to explain what Paul meant. So if we push that up to the probable, then I know it's not certain, it's certainly possible, I think maybe even probable, that the first person ever to expound Paul's letter to the Romans was a woman deacon from the port of Cenchreae. That blows some people's minds. And it would have blown people's minds in many periods of the church. And the church has taken a huge amount of time to wake up to that. The other thing that I always say when faced with this question is go back to the resurrection narratives. The fullest of the resurrection narratives, John chapter 20, Jesus meets Mary Magdalene, the risen Jesus meets Mary Magdalene, and Jesus does not say to Mary, Mary, will you go and get Peter because I've got an important message to get out, and obviously Peter's the one who's got to go and tell this message. Jesus says to Mary, you go and tell my brothers, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. So the first person ever to announce that the crucified Jesus is risen and is the Lord of the world is a woman. And, John does nothing, like Shakespeare, John does nothing by accident. this actually means what it means. So there are signs in the New Testament of something so revolutionary that actually for centuries it would pop up from time to time, but it wasn't appreciated. The trouble is, and I see this, I could do a similar riff about the whole Black Lives Matter movement, where people say, oh dear, the Black Lives Matter movement, it comes out of communism and this, that, and the other. I say, well, for goodness sake, if the church had been doing its job in announcing neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, and living like that, these movements wouldn't have been necessary. But alas, the church has often fallen asleep on the job and been content with various forms of status quo. Now, I'm not totally answering your question, but I'm kind of walking around it and looking in at it from various vantage points. Does that at least begin to address what you're saying? Yeah.
I think having such a wide audience who reads your book, are interested in your writings, I'm just wondering if it would be possible, with your background knowledge on the New Testament, to lend a voice to this situation.
I've done what I can. I've written on this, I've published on this, I speak on it from time to time. One of the frustrating things, actually, which even you discover when you're a bishop, is that you can make statements, you can put out press releases, you can publish books, and they can fall flat. Nobody takes any notice of them. So one has to go on saying things again and again and again, which I've tried to do.
Thank you. Another question.
Question
at the back there from Naomi. Thank you very much, Hannah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Naomi. I'm a PhD in New Testament here. I really enjoyed your biography of Paul, and you really kind of seem to get into Paul's head and kind of live Paul's headspace, which I thought was really cool. And I was just wondering, considering the kind of awkward, difficult place that Paul has in some ways of being the kind of unique voice in some ways of early Christianity, and kind of perhaps unfairly put on a pedestal, unfairly vilified in some cases maybe. I just wondered if you could comment on whether you thought or how Paul might have been affected in his thinking and his life by his experiences of kind of the less heroic episodes of his life, experiences of illness, of going to jail, of apparently economic dependence. I just wondered if you could say anything about that.
Yeah, thank you. One of the most moving things for me, which I tried to bring out in the biography, as you will remember, is when Paul talks in 2 Corinthians about the time when in Ephesus he says, I was so unbearably crushed that I despaired of life itself. Now, if I had somebody come to me pastorally and say, I've just given up, I've had enough, my life is as good as over, I would think this is actually above my pay grade. This person needs to see a serious medical professional, because it sounds like a nervous breakdown of some sort. What caused that, we're not absolutely sure, because Acts doesn't mention that episode, but I suspect it is connected with the riot in Ephesus one way or another, and I've hypothesized how maybe that might have happened. But clearly in 2 Corinthians, which is where this all falls out, Paul looks back on times of intense suffering and is determined that this is not something outside what it means to be an apostle, that this is actually part of being an apostle, is to be beaten up, is to be shipwrecked, is to be hungry and cold and lonely and all the rest of it. And he, so in 2 Corinthians 11, he boasts of all these experiences. And so, you know, this is a standing rebuke to so much Christian success culture today. In 2016, January, I had to preach in a church in New York the weekend that Donald Trump was being inaugurated. And I was given the passage to preach on of 2 Corinthians 11. And I daringly said that the slogan of Paul's opponents in Corinth was, make apostleship great again. I think that gets the point, that Paul is saying, absolutely not. The signs of this is back to broken signposts. The signs of an apostle are sharing the sufferings of Christ. And is that answering your question? Yeah, good, thank you.
I think there's a question just there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I'm John Sturrock. Amongst other things, I work as a mediator. I wonder if I could pick up on the last segment of your discussion with Jolyon about heaven. I mean, throughout your talk, you've infused the talk with the idea of God acting in and through Jesus, God coming to live with humans, the Word becoming flesh, thy kingdom come on earth, and so forth. Two questions, really. Where does that leave those whose whole belief system is based on or built upon the idea that they will go to heaven after death and even perhaps meet up with all their loved ones and live in some sort of state of nirvana, if that's an appropriate phrase? And secondly, what are the implications for the church and the church's message in the world today?
The first one demands that we just say one or two words about how we think wisely and biblically about life after death. And the New Testament, it's very interesting, the New Testament isn't terribly interested in life after death. We are, do a funeral, everyone comes up, where are they now? What do we say about where our beloved whoever is now? But the New Testament doesn't say very much about that. We've been fooled by the fact that in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is constantly talking about the kingdom of heaven, and people read that and they assume that that means going to heaven when you die. It really doesn't. It means the rule of heaven, i.e. God, on earth as in heaven. Now, you know that, but a lot of other people don't. And so we have to unthink all sorts of things. And basically there's been a collusion in Western Christianity with various forms of Platonism. If you go to the first century looking for somebody who teaches that we humans have souls which are exiled from their true home in heaven and we're looking forward to going back there one day, the person we're after is Plutarch, not Paul. He has a treatise on exile which says exactly that at the end of the treatise. Paul doesn't mention that. That's not where he's at. So what we have to be clear about in our teaching is that the Christian view of life after death is a two-stage post-mortem reality, of which the first stage is being, as Paul says, with the Messiah, which is far better. That's Philippians chapter 1. Or to the thief today you will be with me in paradise. Not that Jesus was there that long, because 3 days later he was back again. But there's a sense of being with Jesus, and really that's all we're told. We're not told about meeting up with friends and relatives and so on. That might or might not be the case, but what our curiosity is not entertained, as it were, there. But then, that is phase one, and phase two is the new creation, the new heavens and new earth, into which we will be raised in a new body. And the new body is the real me, the real you, the real us, the person who, by the Spirit, God is creating already in the present. And I think we need to think about the interim, not in terms of a soul, but in terms of the Spirit. Paul talks about the Spirit at that point, and if the Spirit has shaped somebody in the present life, the Spirit, as it were, looks after, holds on to that person in the presence of Christ, in between death and resurrection. And then Paul says, the Spirit is the one who will raise you to new bodily life. Now, so many Christians simply have never thought of this stuff at all, that getting it across is quite difficult. And the time to teach it, by the way, is not at a funeral. People are not up for new theology at a funeral. The time to teach is in the ordinary process of Christian teaching and Bible study. Then the question of how does this affect the church's work in the world? Massively, absolutely massively. The church is called to be the small working model of new creation by the Spirit. There are all sorts of bits of the New Testament which actually say this, which we've just not pulled out in the right way. That's why the unity of the church across ethnic and gender divides, etc., is so important, that we are to live in such a way as to demonstrate to the world. Paul says it in Ephesians 3, that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might be made known to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. Caesar would love to have created a society where all the disparate elements in his empire actually got along together and cohered. He couldn't. Paul knew that God was creating such a society through the gospel and by the Spirit. And the church is to demonstrate to the powers of the world that God is God and Jesus is Lord. And then to see where that falls, and it's not too difficult to see the things I've already mentioned. work with the poor, with education, with medicine. Those are, as it were, starting points, and all sorts of other things flow out from there. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you. Sadly, we're going to have to put a semicolon on the conversation. There'll be a chance, I hope you can all stay on for a reception, which is taking place in the Rainey Hall. You're all really welcome to that. There'll be a chance to buy some of Tom's books. So please do, and Tom, I hope you're happy to sign them, if that's okay.
I'll try. I have arthritis in my wrists at the moment, which is part of long COVID, so signing is rather uncomfortable, but I can do a little squidge.
Clex or something. One of Tom's other best-selling books is Surprised by Hope, and in a way this evening I personally, and I hope you have been surprised by Tom, and I just simply want to say on behalf of us all, thank you so much for such a rich, thoughtful, engaging, well, there's so many other words, and I'm going to stop there, but to say on behalf of us all, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Before you leave, could I just beg your attention, please, for 2 more minutes, just for 2 more minutes, and then the reception is through that door, which Carolina is. But it's just to invite you to 1 or 2 events that we'll be holding over the next 2 days. We are really excited about what's happening in the next 2 days. Delighted to have some leading authors. You may well know Devi Sridhar, well known for her work on COVID, talking tomorrow in the morning about issues related to COVID and global health. There's also a chance to hear Helen Bond and Joe Taylor reflecting on Women Remembered, Jesus' Female Disciples, again tomorrow with Doug Gay in conversation, and then some leading authors, local authors on the ungrateful refugee and homelands, two books I strongly recommend to you, reflecting on issues related to refugees and issues related to anti-Semitism as well. There's also some of Scotland's leading poets talking about religion and poetry in Scotland today, a panel on that, and then also a chance to hear some of perhaps their poetry and reflections on poetry. Then the Booker Prize winner Howard Jacobson will be talking about his recent published book on Mother's Boy, which is a fine memoir of his own experience and life as a youngster and what turned him into a writer, another very interesting story about his writing. Howard Jacobson in conversation. And then also there'll be a chance to hear Rowan Williams on Saturday morning reflecting on visual art, amongst other things. It's a lecture. And then also the well-known S.J. Paris and Leila Abula talking about their work on Bird Summons and S.J. Paris's historical novels. They'll be taking place, followed by, you perhaps know, the well-known former principal of Heriot's, Cameron Wiley, and a leader, the director of a publishing press, Jean Findlay, a very fine author. They'll be talking about their books, Is There a Pigeon in the Room? Reflections on education, and then also The Queen's Lender is a historical novel about the founder of Heriot's and thinking about philanthropy and education. So that'll be a fascinating conversation on Saturday. And then also The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, Disha Fililor, which will be a memorable conversation, and I encourage you to come to that after you've come to Cameron and Jean. Then some of Scotland's top playwrights will be reflecting on their art and craft, including David Gregg, the Lyceum director, also Joe Clifford, author of over 100 plays, Michael O'Neill, who'll be chairing that. This is Paradise, a fine production that went on in the festival this year, and then the last Queen of Scotland author, Jamina Jethwar. And then finally, if I remember rightly, the chance to hear one of Scotland's finest living authors, James Robertson, reflecting not so much on The Land Lay Still, his classic work, but on his more recent work, News of the Dead, also being interviewed by Flora Stevenson, author of What You Call Free. As you can see, there's a feast in the next 2 days. I do hope you can come back, encourage you to come with your friends and your family. Do book. Many of these events are free, and we'd love to see you back, but bring along your friends. But can I say once again, thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to Nick and to Rory and to Neil and to Carolina and to Hannah and the team for all their help today. But thank you again to Tom for such a rich evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.